Hey guys, Raymond here from the Beginner Photography Podcast. Thank you for joining us today. Today we are talking about the difference between full frame and crop sensor cameras. Let's get into it. Hey guys, thank you so much for coming back and listening to this week's episode of the Beginner Photography Podcast. I'm excited for this one because it is another episode that I thought needed full attention from me without a guest. So this week I got an email from a fellow listener named Stephen Elliott. And Stephen wanted to say, first off, how much he loves the podcast, how much he's been learning from the podcast, and how it's been great. He's a designer, but he really wants to get into photography, and just doing some simple research himself found that he had a lot of questions that he didn't have the answers to. So he reached out to me and started asking away. So we're going to get into that here shortly. But first, a little bit about my week. My mom came in from Arizona this week. So she comes in every year on our son's birthday. So Charlie just turned 4 on the 15th, which is nuts to think about. I can't believe it. 4 years old. So my mom flew in, and, she lives in Arizona, so she doesn't really get to see him much. Neither do I, which meant that I had a lot of work, obviously, as I've said in the past few weeks, because it's fall. But I didn't get to any of it while my mom was here. I really wanted to focus on spending time with my mom because, honestly, I just don't see her that much. So, it would have been rude to take that time away from her and just be in front of my computer the whole time. So I really tried to be there and present with my mom. And I think that it's great because this is one of the reasons why I wanted to work from home and, do what I want to do and do what I'm passionate about because, every time that my mom would fly out in the past and, I'd have to work a regular job, God, it would just break my heart every time I'd have to leave. It's like, God, my mom spent all this money to come out here, see me, spend time with me, and here I am, I'm just gonna leave for a quarter of the day. And then the other half of the day, I'll be asleep. So I only get to spend a quarter of my day with my mom. And that sucks. I always hated that. And that just, fueled the fire even more to want to be, a full-time wedding photographer so that when these opportunities come up, I can just totally grab them and, really live life to the fullest. Because, if anybody out there has lost a parent, they know, it's sudden a lot of times, and you don't know how long you're really going to have with them. And my mom and I have a great relationship together, so spending as much time with her was awesome this week. But like I said, I didn't get anything done. I got nothing done. And in fact, if you follow the podcast on Instagram, you'll know that I haven't been doing any daily words of wisdom, and I got quite a few messages from you guys in Instagram asking if I was okay, if I had died, if everything was all right, what was going on. And thank you all so much for the kind words and wondering if I was still alive. But I am. Like I said, I was just spending time with family as I just don't get to enough. And I feel like as I get older, now that I have my own son, a daughter, and a wife, I realize how much more important family is now than I ever did when I was in high school and I lived at home with my mom. And so, but anyway, I totally got off track there. Thank you all who were wondering where I was. And I know that you guys really love the knowledge that I put out with the daily words of photography wisdom over on our Instagram stories. And that is at Instagram Beginner Photo Podcast. All one word. If you guys aren't following us, you should. People are loving it. So that was my week. It's starting to get cold here in Indianapolis. Yesterday morning, I woke up and, 3 days ago, it was 70 degrees. I was outside. I was working on a little bit of construction for my upcoming bridal expo. I didn't have a jacket on. I was actually wearing shorts. I probably didn't have to wear shorts. It wasn't that warm, but I got away with it, And then yesterday morning, even today, I don't think that the temperature has gotten above like 38 degrees. I mean, the temperature just plummeted and it's freezing and it's just... I'm not looking forward to winter. Cold winters. My perfect winter would be like 55 degrees, and then on Christmas Day for like 3 days it would snow, and then after that it'd all be gone. It'd be like, all right, back up to 55, 60 degrees. That would be perfect winter. That'd be perfect winter. But no, moved to Indiana. Who else lives in the Midwest and thinks that it is way too damn cold? Who else wants to move to somewhere sunny like Florida or, somewhere on the East Coast? California. Love California. My favorite. Just too damn expensive. Too expensive. So, all right, let's get into this week's episode. So, like I said, I got an email this week from Stephen Elliott, fellow listener, about what is the difference between crop sensors and full frame sensors, right? So here we go. If you haven't heard these terms before, crop sensor and full frame sensor, what they are, they're just terms that are referring to the size of the sensors inside of a camera. So when you hear a term like full frame sensor, that means that the size of the digital sensor is the size of a 35 millimeter piece of film, right? So if you're watching this on YouTube, there's an old film camera, and this is the sensor. That is the size of the sensor. So when I say full frame sensor on a digital camera, that's referring to a full frame film size sensor. So that's 35 millimeters. That's where the term 35 millimeter film came from. That's the size of the film, and has nothing to do with the lens that you put on the camera. So, mount that back on. When you hear a term like crop sensor, what that is referring to is it is literally a sensor that is smaller in size. So once again, if you're watching this on YouTube, you'll see that this sensor of my Canon 70D is noticeably smaller than it was on my Pentax K1000 film camera, because film is full frame. Once again, if you're watching on YouTube, you can see, let's see if I can angle these right. You can see the difference in size. So what do these terms mean? What does full frame mean? Okay, I get it. It's the size of the sensor. Why does that matter? Why do I care? Why should I care? I've never heard these terms before. What one is better? What one is worse? Well, they both have their strong suits, right? So cameras and remember, I'm most well versed in Canon cameras. So Canon, like entry-level cameras, the Canon T3i, T4i, T5, that whole series, T5i, T6i, all of those cameras have crop sensors. Then the next level up is the Canon 60D, 70D, and now the 80D. All of those also have crop sensors. But the 60, 70, and 80D are much more expensive than the T3i, T4i, T5i, T6i, even though they have the same size sensor inside. The difference between those cameras are going to be things like build quality, as in the 70D is made out of a magnesium alloy body. You can be much more rough with it, whereas the T series cameras are the bodies are made out of plastic, and they're generally smaller. They fit into a smaller package, things like that. But the image sensor and the quality are the same. So think about that. If you're going to buy a new camera, if you think, ooh, I only have enough money for a T6i, but I really want an 80D, just remember that the sensor size and the image quality are going to be the same. Again, it's going to be build quality, things like the maximum shutter speed of the 60, 70, and 80D goes up to 1/8,000th of a second as opposed to 1/4,000th of a second. I mean, unless you're shooting hummingbirds, you're probably not going to need that extra stop of shutter speed. And then full frame cameras are going to be the Canon 6D, the Canon 5D Mark II, 5D Mark III, and then the Canon 5D Mark IV. Now, if you're thinking in your head, if you know anything about these cameras, you're thinking, whoa, I know that the 6D and then the 5D Mark III or the 5D Mark IV are really expensive cameras. Why is that? Well, in part because, for one, of the excellent build quality. Like I mentioned earlier, the difference between the 70D and the 80D, and then the T5i and the T6i, even though they have the same sensor, it's just build quality. That's why the 70D and the 80D are much more expensive. It's a different body of the camera. It's made out of different materials. So the 6D, 5D Mark III, and then the 5D Mark IV, wow, this is getting really intense. Okay, I'm going to really try to make this as easy as possible to understand. The reason why those are so much more expensive is in part because of the build quality of the camera, but the other part is because they are full frame sensors. And typically, when you see a price tag of a camera, you can kind of guess how good of a camera it is. So when you see that, that the Canon 5D Mark IV is $2,500 just for the body. It doesn't come with a lens, which means that you can't even take a picture with it without a lens. You think, wow, that's got to be a really, really good camera. And it is. It is. But that doesn't mean that it is the best. Sometimes crop sensors can be much better than a full frame sensor. So crop sensors are going to be, again, in cameras that you typically start off with, because full frame cameras require a bit of an investment. So unless, I don't know, you were gifted this full frame camera by a really rich uncle who's just like, screw it, take it. Like, I don't even care. Or, you just decided to jump in to full frame and, spend a ton of money, you're most likely going to have a crop sensor camera, especially if, you're listening to a podcast like the Beginner Photography Podcast. This isn't the Masterclass of Photography podcast. So, starting off with a crop sensor doesn't mean that you're going to be limited, and it doesn't mean that your camera is bad at all. So there's a few things to think about when deciding between a crop sensor and a full frame camera. So when I first started out, I started off in video, so cinematography. I really wanted to shoot movies. And you always shoot movies at the time on 35 millimeter film, which is full frame. So when it came time to buying a digital camera, I really wanted a full frame camera to start off with. But at the time, I didn't have the money. It didn't make sense for me to buy a full frame camera. So I just bought a crop sensor camera. And it turned out that I wish that I wasn't so blind by wanting a full frame camera, because there were so many people who told me, oh, you want to shoot weddings? Well, you can't shoot a wedding on a crop sensor camera. You got to have a full frame camera. You want to, shoot portraits? Got to have a full frame camera. Can't shoot that on a crop frame. But they were just dead wrong. People just don't know what they're talking about a lot of times. They just use such generalizations. When I started off with a crop sensor camera, which was a Canon XT. So this is a long time ago. This is 10 years ago now. The Canon XT I had, it was 8 megapixels. This thing was just at the time it was really cool, but by today's standards, it was very basic digital camera. I mean, the screen on the back, I think it was 1.5 inches. It was tiny, you know what I mean? And now if you have anything less than 4 inches or 3 inches, then they just don't make them any smaller anymore. So I had to figure out how to make my crop sensor camera take photos as good as a full frame sensor. Now, there are things that a crop sensor can't replicate, but there are a lot of things that it can. So one of the huge bonuses of a crop sensor camera is that it magnifies your image. So a crop sensor literally refers to if you took a photo with a full frame camera and then you just cropped in, that would be the size of your sensor. So if you were shooting with a 50 millimeter lens and you put that on a crop sensor camera like the Nikon D7000 series, or the Canon T3i, T4i, T6i, all the way up. I'm just going to start calling it the T6i. Any entry-level camera, Canon T6i, that's what I'm going to call it, just to make this easier. So if you have a 50 millimeter lens, the millimeters labeled on your lens is referring to if the full frame equivalent. So if your lens says, most lenses that come with cameras are just the 18 millimeter to 55 millimeter lens. It's a zoom lens, small plastic, and that's referring to the focal length being compared to a full frame camera. So if you put that on a full frame camera, it would be effective to an 18 millimeter lens, which in full frame terms is very wide. But when you put it on a crop sensor, you have to magnify the focal length by 1.5 times. Essentially, it's like 28 millimeters, which is a standard for most cameras, good for just point and shoots and stuff. They typically start off at just 28 millimeters. And then it goes up to 55 millimeters. So when you multiply that by 1.5, it's about 75, 80 millimeters on a full frame camera. So in full frame terms, if you have a 24 millimeter lens and you put that on a crop sensor camera, that's going to be a 35 millimeter lens. So it zooms in, okay? And I know that this seems really confusing, right? But think about it like it gives you a little bit of extra zoom. So if you have like a really telephoto lens, say that you're going to a baseball game or a football game and you want to bring a camera. And let's just say that in this imaginary world, you have both a full frame camera and a crop sensor camera. What camera are you going to bring? You're going to bring the crop sensor camera because it's going to effectively magnify your lens choice. So if you have a 75 to 200 millimeter lens, instead of only going to be able to zoom into 200 millimeters, you're going to be able to zoom into an equivalent of 300 millimeters. And that's like 50% more. That is quite a bit further. And that would be the difference between looking at a little ant and, getting right up there in the action of these sports. And that's really what you want in these photos, right? Is to get up there in the action, get really compelling photos. So crop sensors are typically good, like we just talked about, for sports. It's also really good for wildlife stuff. Not like you're going to be going out there, but safaris, bird watching, anything where, going to the zoo, once again, where you have a bit of space in between you and the subject and you really need to get in close, but you don't have, a $15,000 of 300 millimeter lens. You just have your $150 75 to 200 millimeter lens, but you want to get that 300 millimeter close up, then just use a crop sensor camera. It's going to be able to zoom you in there much further and you're going to be able to get the shot. It's also great for astrophotography. Once again, because if you're shooting up into space, well, stars are pretty damn far away, and you're going to want, the most impact of your image, and that's going to be to just pack it full of stars. So you're going to want to zoom in really close. Once again, use a crop sensor camera. Now, when you're thinking about using a full frame camera, okay, so we just talked about why crop sensors are good, when it is best to use a crop sensor, not when you can only use a crop sensor, when it is best to use a crop sensor. Sports, wildlife, astrophotography, any time where you need to get close up, but you just can't physically get close up. You're in your seats in your stand, you're behind a fence at the zoo, or the stars are just really far away, you're going to want a crop sensor camera. But now, when would you want to use a full frame camera? Well, almost the exact opposite of all of those things. So full-frame cameras are great for portraits. Full-frame cameras are great for weddings. Full-frame cameras are great for architecture. They're also great for landscapes. Now, once again, that doesn't mean that you have to use a full-frame camera for portraits, weddings, landscapes, architecture. But they're best suited for those things. So full-frame, it's better for portraits because portraits are really effective when you can get a background that's out of focus. And one of the determining factors of how out of focus your background is how close you're focusing on your subject. So with a larger sensor, you're able to get closer to your subject, meaning that the background is further out of focus. I'll talk about that in just a few minutes. One of the other reasons, that's the same reason why it's great for weddings. At a wedding, you are in, you don't know what's coming next. You don't know before you show up what the room is going to look like, if it's going to be a big room, if it's going to be a teeny, teeny, tiny room, and there's going to be a lot of people in there. You don't know what the lighting situation is going to be. Typically in churches, it's mixed light. They have stained glass windows, so like different colored light is coming in, and they have fluorescent lights, and then they have tungsten lights. It's just all kind of screwed up. It's everywhere. So being able to get a really wide shot is great. Being able to make a teeny tiny room look larger by getting everyone in the photo is I don't want to say that it's imperative, but it's just a trick for wedding photography, for your wedding photography bag, right? Being able to make a teeny tiny room look larger so that you can get everybody in the shot. That's key, because the last thing that you want to do is be in a teeny tiny room, only have a 50 millimeter lens on your crop sensor camera, which is essentially 75 millimeters, which technically is a telephoto lens, and then have a bride say, "Oh, can we get a group shot?" And now you have a lens that is suited for, portraits, just getting a full face in a photo. And now you're expected to get, 5, 6, 7 bridesmaids that are in this tiny room into one single shot. And it's just not possible. So full frame definitely lets you get a wider frame of view because it's the true focal length, like we talked about. There's no magnification. When you put a 24 millimeter lens on a full frame camera, you're really looking at 24 millimeter field of view. Like that is really the angle, 24 millimeters. And that is why, one of the reasons why it's really good for weddings. The other is, like I talked about just a second ago, the mixed lighting, right? Full frame sensors. So say that you have a full frame sensor that is a 20 megapixel sensor, and then you also have a crop frame sensor that is 20 megapixels. Both sensors have the exact same amount of megapixels, but on the full frame camera, each pixel is spread out further apart, meaning that each pixel has more room to suck in more light. So in a really low light situation, like a very dimly lit church, or a concert, or you would think astrophotography, but it's not astrophotography because you're not trying to expose properly, or like a really dimly lit reception hall that has no windows. All of these things are great for full frame cameras because that's when you can bump up the ISO. With a larger frame, grain becomes less noticeable. So one of the reasons why people say that they want a full frame camera is because you can get low light photos that aren't noisy or grainy or blurry or anything like that. And that's because, like I just said, the sensor is larger, so you can collect more light without having to show off the amount of grain because all the pixels are packed together in a smaller package, if that makes sense. It's getting really technical, and I'm hoping that you guys are keeping up. But this is really jam-packed with a lot of info, but we're going to keep going. And I really hope that I'm making a little bit of sense here. Landscape photography is really good for full frame cameras because you can just get a wider perspective. So you can get more land in your photos. And when you get more land in your photo, I mean, that's what landscape is, right? Just getting as much land in the photo as possible. So now I just said that full frame cameras are best suited to shoot weddings. But you know how much I love my Fuji cameras. Love them, love them, love them. I want to be buried with this camera. It is everything that I want in a camera at a wedding because it fits my style. Now, if you're watching this on YouTube or you know anything about the Fuji series cameras, they have crop sensors. Shocker. I know. Yeah. I shoot my weddings on a crop sensor camera. So here we go. I mean, this is just full circle. When I first started out, I got a crop sensor camera, and I knew that I wanted to shoot weddings, so I got a full frame camera. And honestly, it really didn't change my photography at all. It made my photos look a little bit better because of the better low light performance during a reception, or I could get a little bit closer, which made the background all out of focus and beautiful. But I think that it was less about being a full frame camera and more about I would have got the exact same result if I would have just used a really, really good lens on a crop sensor camera. And that is exactly what Fuji has done. So Fuji cameras are, let's see, so this is, if you're watching on YouTube, this is my Fuji X Pro 2, and this is a Canon 70D, right? Now, let me just take the lenses off for comparison. My Fuji camera is way, way smaller. It is thinner all the way around. I mean, just look at the two, right? You can match them up to each other. Way thinner. Oh, I probably shouldn't have turned the camera on. But anyway, it's thinner because, for one, it's a mirrorless camera. For two, it's because it's a crop sensor. If they would have made it a full frame crop sensor camera, the lenses for this thing would have been huge. And when you have huge lenses on a tiny body, well, I mean, the lens might fall off it might not structurally be very well handled, I guess. But having this small package in my hand means that I'm just like nice and fluid. I can walk around on a wedding day. It doesn't weigh me down. And yet I said that it's not as good like crop sensors generally aren't as good in low light, or, your background isn't as out of focus. But that's only half the story, because Fuji has made the correct lens choices for having crop sensor cameras. So they make ultra wide lenses so that you can get an equivalent ultra wide photo with a crop sensor camera as you can with a full frame camera. They also make their lenses really, really fast. So this lens right here is a 23 millimeter, which is equivalent to a 35 millimeter on a full frame camera, f1.4. Now that's a really fast lens. If you look at any of your lenses, I'm guessing that, they're probably f3.5 to f5.6, or, maybe you have an f2.8 in one of your lenses. But if you have the nifty 50, from either Canon or Nikon, it's going to be an f1.8. And that lens is going to bring your photography to the next level. But then opening it up another stop, which Fuji has, to f1.4, has just guaranteed that these lenses are able to create more out of focus backgrounds, more separation between your subject and the background, to give you that feel as if it's a full frame camera. Also, the whole, not being good in low light, because Fuji makes the cameras, Fuji makes the sensors, they know what they're doing, and they've created an entirely new sensor type. And, well, honestly, I think that it's great in low light. I've never been to a wedding where I thought, oh man, I wish that I had better ISO performance, because this just isn't good in low light. Because I will pick a grainy photo over a blurry photo any day of the week. So already, I don't really care that much about my grain or the ISO performance. Sure, I want it to look great, but at the end of the day, I'm gonna go up to ISO 8000 if I need to, and as long as the shot isn't blurry. Whereas on a full frame camera, you can do the exact same thing. So that is why Fuji cameras work for me, even though they're crop sensor cameras. So I guess I should say rather, that is why a crop sensor camera works best for me. Having a full frame camera, they're big cameras, honestly, and big cameras require big lenses. And big cameras, big lenses mean that they're going to weigh a lot, right? So there's times where, a full frame camera is the right choice. A lot of people prefer having a full frame camera. And honestly, the image quality coming out of this Fuji is not what it was out of my 5D Mark III before I sold it. But it's close enough for me. It's close enough that I get more benefits out of Fuji with a crop sensor than I did on Canon with a full frame sensor. But once again, there's a lot of people. In fact, I would say, like, I'm one of the rare few professional wedding photographers who shoot on a crop sensor. The majority is shot on a full frame sensor. And I wouldn't be surprised if Fuji comes out with a full frame sensor in the future. And when they do, I'll jump on board because I really like Fuji and I like what they're doing. But it's not just because it's a full frame sensor. It's because I trust Fuji, and now they have made a product that is, better. But if you shoot, a lot of concerts, or anything where there's going to be bad lighting, low lighting, generally you're going to want a full frame camera. Just because, like I talked about earlier, the amount of extra spacing that a full frame camera has between its pixels means that it can collect more information in the low light. So when you go to edit these photos, you're going to be able to extract more out of the low light. You're going to get better performance. You're going to get a photo that is better exposed in low light than you ever would have if you used a crop sensor camera. But aside from that, I'm happy with my crop sensor. I think that you should too. Really. Once again, when I first started off, I really wish that I would have known how little a full-frame camera would have changed my photography. I thought that once I had a full-frame camera, that's it. I'm going to be a pro. This is going to be great. People are going to look at me differently. My photos are going to, be different. They're going to be wonderful. People are going to see the image quality of a full-frame camera over crop sensor. Nobody did. I did. I tried to show my wife some, differences, and she knows my photography. She can't tell the difference. She's like, which camera was this taken on? Which camera was that taken? It's like, you can't see that this is a crop sensor. You can't see that this is a full frame sensor. In all honesty, the majority of people, the majority of clients, they're not going to be able to tell. What they want in their photos is good emotion. They want, artistic portraits. None of those things are predicated on having a full frame sensor or not. That is all up to you. That is all in your head. Knowing your camera inside and out, being able to use it properly. So back to Steven. Steven has a 7D, but he wants to upgrade to a 5D Mark III. So in his email, I asked him why. I said, well, why do you want to upgrade to a 5D Mark III? Because once again, knowing why you want to upgrade is a better question to ask yourself than simply, well, I just know that full frame is better. Because in a lot of situations, it's not. And what Steven said is that he really wants to shoot, he wants to be more versatile. So he wants to shoot more weddings. What Steven said is that he wants to be more versatile and that he wants to be able to shoot photos and video. So when you're shooting video, because of the low light performance of a full frame camera, I gotta say it's probably the right choice. Now again, it's not the only choice. There are so many people out there who just kill it with video on a Canon 70D or a Canon 80D. If anybody watches like any vlogs on YouTube, they'll know that Casey Neistat shoots with either a 70D or an 80D, whatever one isn't broken at the time. And I mean, the image quality is incredible that comes out of his camera. So it all just comes down to, what you can afford and, what it is that you're shooting. So if you're shooting like a movie and you can only afford a crop sensor camera, then you're going to want to invest in really good lenses. Lenses that can open up to 1.4, 1.2, even 2.8 would be fine, honestly, on a crop sensor camera. But having a lens that opens up much further is really going to give you that cinematic look. But, if you're just shooting like stuff around the house or your kids or, you really don't have a lot of money to invest in, a crop sensor is going to be great. It's going to be more than fine for you. In fact, I do have money to buy a full frame camera, but I choose a crop sensor camera. So hopefully that tells you something. Now, one of the last things that I want to talk about is the blurriness or the out of focus background and what makes a photo's background out of focus. And it's two things. And they both depend on the lens. and much less on the sensor. They actually don't depend on the sensor at all. The sensor is just a byproduct. So the things that matter are the lens's aperture. So you want to open it up as wide as it'll go, right? So in my case right here on this Fuji lens, it's 1.4. If you have the Nifty 50, it's going to be 1.8. If you have the $2,000 Canon 85mm 1.2 lens, it's going to be 1.2. However, I'm guessing not a lot of you guys have that, including me. I don't have it. It's a great lens, but man, it's heavy. Anyway, the next thing that it depends on is the distance, is how close you're focusing to something. So if you'll notice in macro photography, you have to focus really, 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 really close. And because of that, anything that is an inch away, we'll just talk about a ring here for a second because I'm a wedding photographer and that's what I do. Anything that is like an inch away from the lens, an inch away from the ring that I'm focusing on is completely out of focus, right? 1 inch past the ring, completely out of focus. Now let's say I was taking a picture of somebody who was, 4 or 5 feet away. 1 inch behind their head is not going to be completely out of focus. If I'm taking a picture of somebody 30 feet away, 1 inch behind their head is not going to be completely out of focus. 10 feet behind their head, probably not going to be completely out of focus. 20 feet behind their head, that's going to be when you start to get out of focus. Even with all of the exact same settings, with the only thing changing being the distance away from the camera. So that is why when you have a full frame sensor, you're able to focus closer to the subject. And therefore, it appears as if the background is blurrier. Because technically it is, since you can actually get closer to a subject. But once again, the other part of, you can't change that. If you have a crop sensor camera, you can't change, having a full frame and being able to get closer to a subject. But what you can change is having a better lens, having a wider aperture, and just making sure that it has a good, close focusing range. So in this case, on this Fuji camera, I can focus as close as about 7 inches away. And if I'm taking a picture of this microphone right here at 7 inches away, I can't even see the computer in the background because it's so completely out of focus. And that's what it is that you're looking for. When you're taking a portrait of somebody's eyes, you really want their ears to be out of focus. So you try to get as close as humanly possible to them so that the closer that you get, the further things are out of focus behind them. All of those things you can control when you have a crop sensor camera. So I really hope that today I didn't completely just lose you. I hope that you didn't completely zone out thinking, I have no idea what this guy is talking about. Because the bullet points here are, because you have that full frame does not mean that it is better than a crop sensor camera. There's a lot of situations where a crop sensor camera is equal to or better than a full frame camera. Just because you have a crop sensor camera, it doesn't mean that you can't get photos that look like a full frame camera. You know that you can rent or buy lenses with faster apertures like 1.8 or 1.4 that will give you that creamy, out of focus background look. And also there are certain tricks that you can use so that when you take low light photos with a crop sensor camera, that you can get better performance out of when you're editing. And I talk about those in today's show notes. So if you have any questions or if you struggle with shooting photos in low light with your crop sensor camera, head over to today's show notes at beginnerphotographypodcast.com/podcast/041. And then I'll have a description of what I do to get better low light performance out of my crop sensor cameras so that the photos are less grainy. I know that you guys are going to want to read about that. If you guys are part of the newsletter, you also got today's email, which talks about that as well. So, guys, that's all that I have for today's episode. Again, I hope that this makes sense. And if you have any questions, and I know that you do, I apologize. So feel free to shoot me an email at beginnerphotographypodcast@gmail.com, or reach out to us, send us a message on Instagram or even Facebook would be great as well. Guys, I also, if you have signed up for the newsletter, you know that I emailed you with a way for another entry into this GoPro contest. Everybody has been entering this thing. The response has been absolutely incredible. I really wanted to make it fair for everybody. So I'm giving everybody an additional chance to win an entry to win the GoPro camera. So that was all in this week's newsletter. And if you didn't get it because you're not signed up for the newsletter, because you're not signed up for the podcast newsletter, then go ahead and head over to beginnerphotographypodcast.com. Click the button up at the top that says, if you want to win a GoPro, enter here. Sign up for the newsletter, and I will send you all of the information that you need to find out how to not only enter to win the GoPro, but get up to 3 entries in to win the GoPro. That's all that I got for this week, guys. I hope that you got any sort of information or value out of this podcast and that it made sense. Oh, also, side note, the sensor size in a GoPro is only 2/3 of an inch. That's like that's smaller than the cap on your chapstick. Just think about that for a second. Think about the cap on a chapstick compared to a piece of 35 millimeter film. Just think about that for a second. And then think about all the incredible photos and video you've seen come out of a GoPro. You know, it's not all about sensor size. So until next week, guys, I will talk to you later. I want you to get out. I want you to start shooting more. And I want you to post those photos on Instagram and use hashtag #MyBPP so I can check them out and follow along on your journey. Guys, until next week, I will see you later and keep shooting. Later, guys.